بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. ضيوفنا الأعزاء، معكم شهد الهاجري من سفراء قمة إرثنا للشباب، ويسرني دعوتكم للجلسة بعنوان إعادة تصور تمويل المناخ لمستقبل مستدام في خضم الأزمة ثلاثية الأبعاد التي تعتري الكوكب بأكمله وتتمثل في تغير المناخ وفقدان التنوع البيولوجي والتلوث العالمي. أصبحت الحاجة إلى بناء القدرة على الصمود أكثر إلحاحاً من أي وقت مضى، غير أن تحقيق أهداف التنمية المستدامة بيتطلب ما يقارب 4.2 تريليون دولار سنوياً، تحتاج منها الدول النامية 2.5 تريليون دولار، وقد أدى التراجع الأخير في التزامات المساعدة الإنمائية الرسمية على الصعيد العالمي، وتزايد التخلي عن أهداف المناخ من قبل القطاعين العام والخاص إلى تفاقم العقبات أمام حشد وتوجيه التمويل بكفاءة. ستتناول هذه الجلسة التحديات الرئيسية الناجمة عن هذا التطور، بما فيه ذلك تشتت آليات التمويل وغياب المحفزات للحلول السوقية والعوائق وعدم كفاية الاستثمارات طويلة الأجل. سيناقش المشاركون حلولاً مبتكرة لتجاوز هذه المعوقات، مثل تحسين التنسيق بين مصادر التمويل وإزالة الحواجز أمام الاستثمار الخاص، ودمج مفهوم القدرة على الصمود في الأنظمة المالية، وتمكين المجتمعات المحلية من الوصول إلى الموارد واستخدامها لتحقيق حلول مستدامة طويلة الأمد. رحبوا معي بمدير الجلسة جاستن ماندي.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Justin Mundy. I'm the chair of the Earthna Centre. I would like to ask for your pity, commiseration, sympathy and support, because before I bring up this fantastic panel we have here, there are three things which I'd like to put up which are just unfair. The first is coming after such a wonderful moderation from the previous panel. Within that, coming after Rajendra Singh, which is always a catastrophe. But thirdly, to talk about finance. So far this morning, we've heard about busting bonsais, the philosophy of technological determinism, and we're going to talk about money. Money is usually a very boring subject, although it is useful on occasions. The title of this session, Reimagining climate finance, tragically has just become not something which we can do hypothetically, but something we have to do with urgency. So, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, on that basis, I'd like to introduce you to a wonderful panel. To start off, may I introduce Maya Groff, who is the convener of the Climate Governance Commission. Maya, please. Then Orvis Samadi, who is now the Vice Chair of the Steering Committee of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, is formerly the Deputy Executive Secretary General and of the UNFCCC, and also Li Hao, who is the CEO of the Villiers Institute, and previously was the person who you would have seen on the slopes of Davos in January looking extremely hassled as 30,000 people walk past. So, dear panelists, here we are. When we first had this idea, and for their sins, Maya and Lee have been on the Content Advisory Committee of this Earthna Summit, we had the thought that we were going to have a very exciting conversation about structured finance, which I can imagine the excitement in the room would have been almost unbearable. Luckily, since we first had the idea, the world has started more or less to fall to bits. And the idea about talking about climate and climate change has become not as popular as it used to be. One of the things we are still allowed to talk about, I think, is resilience and survival. And in a funny sort of way, we seem to have forgotten the relationship between climate change, resilience, and survival. For some of us who have been in the space for some time, it's always peculiar that climate change and the impacts of climate change, water security, food security, health, energy security, social and political security are seen somehow to be separate buckets, as opposed to being completely aligned one to the other. And these buckets are something which we need to understand the connections to and the synergies of. So what I was hoping to do, and starting with your great work, here we have, just I should say, we have here this perfect combination of an expert in governance and partnerships, a huge expert in policy and climate change, and who's done so much on this, and then an expert in the private sector to how to bring these things together. So we have all aspects of this conundrum here. So what do you see as being some of the, not just financial, structural problems, but some of the broader synergistic system problems we're facing?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Justin. And thanks for framing this discussion. And finance, I'm quite excited actually about this topic and having this panel because I think there's unbelievably exciting potential for transformation in this field of financing for climate and nature. And as many of you may know, we had last autumn the COP29 in Baku, which was labeled the climate COP. So there was actually a lot of productive discussions there. Climate COPs and the COP processes generally move very slowly. By profession, I'm a multilateral treaty expert primarily, and it can be very grueling and mind-numbing, and international treaties work well when you have decades or centuries to get the cooperation right, but as we all know, we don't have decades or centuries to really arrest the worst effects of climate change. So essentially, the governance, the structural problems, we at the Climate Governance Commission, we're making recommendations together with partners, the Club of Rome, Al Gore's Climate Reality Project, Johan Rockström at the Potsdam Institute, Ban Ki-moon, Christiana Figueres. We wrote a letter about strengthening the climate COPs to be more focused on implementation and effectiveness. And this is true for the finance area. So at COP29, there was a commitment, a new commitment by states to raise 300 billion by 2035, and then an additional 1.3 trillion to also aim for. And this is an excellent step. However, it is too little and too late. According to experts we've consulted with, we need about $1 trillion a year now by 2030. We have about just over 4 years or so of our carbon budget left, and we need to be investing in the transition, the energy transition, the other transformations we need across our economies and societies right now. So this urgency has not yet permeated and percolated through our governance systems. So this is where I see some potential in the next years, if we can see more bold leadership and new alliances forming, to think about not only turbocharging the commitments at the COPs, but also looking outside of the UNFCCC, the COP systems, the Biodiversity Convention, to look at novel sources of public international finance, which was on the agenda and talked about really prominently for the first time, I would say, at the COPs. So that's some exciting potential there that I can say more about later.
Brilliant, Maya. Thank you so much indeed. I mean, the sense of urgency could not be greater. When we started all this stuff, seems like a millennia ago, we thought that actually where we are now in terms of the level of climate change is where we were going to be in 50 years' time. So we've massively underestimated the speed that this is happening. And obviously the political dialogue and the policy dialogue has a rather volatile relationship to that science. And it always strikes me, and I think the relationship between governance and climate appears to think that governance is a political process and climate change is a political process as opposed to being physics. It's science, it's physics. And the relationship between physics and policy is something which we badly need to sort of re-establish, I think, which, my learned friend, is exactly your area of expertise. Where do you see where do you see the sort of within that, the key structural problem that we should address from your perspective?
Thank you very much, and a very warm good afternoon, good morning to everyone. And actually, before I get into the topic, I'd like to thank Earthna and Qatar Foundation for bringing us together, and thank you, Justin, for chairing this incredibly important session at this stage. I'd like to maybe set the context of what I'm going to say. We're living in an extremely volatile world in which finance plays an extremely important role, and you must have all heard about the VUCA world, the volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, but it's now progressed to BANI world, which is now brittle, anxious, non-linear, and incomprehensible. And that applies to finance, and particularly also climate finance. Picking up from what Maya was just saying, the developed world had committed many years ago to provide $100 billion to the developing countries to adapt to the impacts of climate change, and that did not materialize until recently. So we should move away from that perception and the mindset that the rich world will provide that funding to the developing world, including the decision at COP29 in Baku, 300 billion as opposed to 1.3 trillion. So we really need to reimagine. We really need to be very transformative, even radical, in terms of looking at how to mobilize finance. And that is to say that there is not enough funding out there. There is. If you look at the different funds, the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, the Adaptation Fund, and now the recent fund for responding to loss and damage. If you combine all of that together, what is needed is sort of deconstructing the bureaucratic processes around these funds to make it more efficient, to cut down the red tape and the bureaucratic barriers. And just by doing that, I think we can mobilize something to between 2 to 4 trillion annually. So that is something that the COPs in the future need to take it up and look into, in how we can sort of democratize that finance that is already available and not get into this mindset of developed versus developing countries.
Okay, thank you very much. And just at the risk of depressing us all further, can I, before going to Lee, can I just drill down a bit into that? I mean, May, you talked about we need $1 trillion, some say it's 2.3 trillion, some say it's 4. What it is, it's a lot of noughts. And it's so many noughts that after you get beyond $1 trillion, it's just a lot, one way or the other. And also, it's a lot that is endlessly receding, it seems to me. It's never sort of there. But to Ovi, your point about the money is there in the multilateral sort of organizations, I mean, the rather tragic reality is that it was there, and we don't know if it's going to be topped up. We've had a massive cut in, obviously, in support from the US government. We've had reductions in ODA being signaled, yet to happen in its entirety, from the UK, from France, from Germany, from Sweden, and others. So what you've said in terms of the money needs, we need to understand that the developed world is not going to foot the bill totally, has become particularly true. And we now know, the rumor has it, it may be wrong, but the rumor has it that today there will be an executive order taking away the tax exemption from the US philanthropies who are looking at climate change and social justice, which is an interesting combination. So I just wonder, how confident are you that the multilateral system that we have all been relying on in terms of these large international funds is going to be there to be more accessible too?
Yeah, I continue to be optimistic about the way things are or will go in the future, because we are facing a perfect storm. And this is exactly when the ingenuity of the experts and the financial markets and people who have the policy triggers can be innovative and bring about that change. And that change is to do with now liberating the private sector finance and de-risking the capital and providing that opportunity for the corporations to invest in climate models, climate solutions. And that is something that the multilateral banks are already picking it up, and it's happening. It's a question of accelerating the pace of that change and transformation.
Brilliant. So we need to hold on to the optimism.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
There's no other way.
And having myself sat on both the public and the private sector side of the table over the years, I do know that often the public sector response to a change in policy is that the private sector will provide, which is a perfect segue to Lee to see if he thinks the private sector is going to provide. I mean, you've had years of wandering up and down the slopes of Davos in January, corralling the private sector to be positive, which with enormous success. You now are the CEO of the Villiers Institute, which has had a recent convening in Geneva a couple of weeks ago, where you brought the good and the great together to talk about this. Is the private sector there, or is it running for the hills, do you think? Can we be as optimistic as Ovi suggests we should?
Ooh, good question. Maybe I'll start with, again, a little bit of context. I think those in business that will thrive in this environment are simply going to be those who have the skill set of systems thinking. And by that I mean, obviously being able to sort of connect the dots in a way and see sort of understand the relationships of what's happening in these changes. More importantly, it's something, and I also, a professor last week, I was teaching a course aptly titled Disruption and Innovation in International Business at the University of St. Gallen with my graduate students. And I made the point that Steve Jobs once said that creativity is about connecting the dots. And I think when we say reimagine, we just have to look at what's breaking apart and how do we reconnect them. And I think that's the first, I think that's going to be very advantageous for those who do. So let's just step back a little bit. I think one thing we need to start to appreciate is that, yes, there is, if you speak to businesses in a forum such as this, there'll be quite a different narrative. But if you took what they spoke and put it into Google or ChatGPT, you'll probably find that they're probably saying pretty much the same thing. But of course, they're very cautious about word choice, right? And you mentioned that in some ways. And I sense that. But I think where I'm at on this is that there's a bigger systemic change happening. And this is, speaking of finance, I mean, today, we're seeing signals that the US Treasury is not the safe haven asset anymore. There's a reason why gold is at a record high today. There's a reason why there's a resurgence of Bitcoin. I think people are looking to where, obviously they can deploy that capital. And I think this is the opportunity, because what we're talking about today is where the great opportunity is. This is good for, it's going to be good for your returns, but also good for the planet and good for, your license to operate. I mean, you can't really, that's a triple win. And I see the opportunity of where capital being deployed, because there's fundamentally enough money there. I mean, and we also have to rethink the markets. I think we are now looking at we could talk about VUCA or is it BANI, or is it even, but in a way it's these emerging markets and developing economies ex-China that we're talking about, because now we have China and then we have Europe in sort of ways, the US sort of reshaping the sort of order and certainly how the governance and the flow of capital. But I think those, if you look at those emerging markets and developing economies today, I think only 20% of the investment in green technologies goes in those geographies. I believe, only half of really the big investments, or I think probably a third, go in those geographies. And I think that's going to be a great opportunity, because we're in a situation where if you're in the advanced economies, what's safe? Where would you put your money today, right? In many ways. And you have, I get frustrated, in the financial communities, where in one level they're saying, well, it's so difficult to price, the risk on this. How do you do nature-based solutions? We don't really have a price for biodiversity on top of what we would put on the carbon piece, and all these reasons. Yet you talk to another department, and they'll talk to you about alternative assets that make you wonder about, why would I put my money in, digital currencies or the art market or the such. So I think what's going to happen is that there will be those in the world that will stick to the course, and they will just not raise their head as high, maybe, and maybe sort of be very selective in how they describe their work. But I also think there is a whole new opportunity to connect some dots that weren't connected before, and that will lead to this really a great opportunity, because of the fact that the markets are really changing. And now, add the tariff layer to this. right? And so this uncertainty can play in the favor because makes sense. What I don't understand is, for example, if you do a utility level photovoltaic project, the cost of capital is twice that in these emerging markets, developed economies. It makes no sense because over time, that's where the people will be and the opportunities will be. So I think we should sort of step back a little bit and see all the other systemic changes that are happening, and then sort of reorder how we want to connect those dots, because I think that's what some of the very sharp business people are doing.
That's a great answer. And just to circle back to mine in a second, but just to pick up something you said, and again, just to be unfair and to drill a little bit. One of the issues that people always assume is that if you have a market failure, it's possible to create another market to adjust the market failure without having actually addressed the reasons why the market failed in the first place. And so what we've got a long tail of initiatives over the last 30 years are policies and governance structures which indicate and incentivize people to supply a market, whether it's carbon or biodiversity credits or anything else, without having addressed the demand side. And in the absence of a demand, you've got a lot of supply, but you haven't got a price, or not a price, which is very helpful. So I wonder how it is that we can do this piece of magic of internalizing the environmental externalities in such a way that a price mechanism is real and actually has people who want to take it.
Well, also in that, I think there's another layer, which is there are always new sources of demand. So I mentioned to you I was teaching this course, these graduate students last week, and every year they have to come up with a project, each of their teams. And two of the three projects were very interesting, right? One was about how to deal with the carbon footprint of AI and basically large-scale data centers. So I said, oh, very interesting. And my students were doing the research on this, and they say, great. And if you think about who will be the purchasers, and we can just look at the amount of investment being put into developing and training large language models. So there's a new market, and we know that the big players there all have to look at somehow dealing with their commitments when it comes to carbon, right? So there's an opportunity at many layers. The other project was, obviously in energy storage, where young people are very keen about the consistency and development and scaling of renewables, but they understand the storage piece. But more importantly, they went to the level of alternative storage capacities, not just with lithium, sodium biodies, solid state. So I do think it is about, again, sort of skating to where the puck is, as the great Wayne Gretzky, the Canadian hockey player, once said, you're not where it is, right, where it's going to be. And I think for all of this change, I advise my students that if things are changing very quickly, you need to slow things down. That means you have to set your horizons out a little bit further. It's like skiing or downhill cycling. If you look at the front of your tips of your skis or the front of your front wheel, you're going to crash. It's just too much to process. But if you can set your horizon out just a little bit further, then I think it slows down enough to where you can see where things are going to connect or need to connect. So I feel, for example, we see all the capital going and the interest going into artificial intelligence. We have a carbon issue and an energy issue to deal with, and that's part of the energy transition. So maybe it's through those groups that are going to be the large purchasers. So I think that's the sort of way of connecting dots that I would approach this going forward.
That's great. Thank you so much. And just taking that idea then, and swinging it back to you in terms of governance, good governance and good policy requires a narrative between the public and the private sector. The assumption often is actually the governance is ahead of the private sector and the private sector responds. But very frequently that's not the case. The private sector is actually ahead of the curve. But what it does require is not certainty, but consistency in policy, so it can take an intelligent view of what the cost of capital is going to be. Given the volatility and the fluctuation that we just heard about, how do you see policy and governance making now, and what is required? We have a multipolar world, it appears, with different narratives and inflection points within those narratives, which, despite the universal nature of globalization, is starting to look a bit icky in places. How does your world interact there in a constructive way?
Yeah, well, you mentioned previously how much we've underestimated, of course, the effects of climate change, the speed, the acceleration. The models that scientists were using are now updated, and the more that they're updated and refined, unfortunately, the more we find that we are really in hot water, and there is an absolute urgency on the scientific. So at a certain point, there is the physics, right, of our Earth system realities that every sober policymakers at all levels of governance, including the city level, will have to get their heads around, because the effects are starting to accumulate. And so, for example, in terms of the economic damages of the realities of physics starting to hit us, the Los Angeles fires, I've heard numbers quoted about 240 billion damage. Add in a couple of hurricanes over about the last year in the US, then you get up to about 500 billion or more. And then you see, okay, the international commitment for investment in climate action is under that amount, and that's just 1 year's damage, one country. So there's those damages which are starting to accrue very seriously. And there's also, in addition to the science being refined with, tipping point science, the UK government, for example, has started a new project under their ARIA program to try to really refine their scientific knowledge and early warning system for a couple of the planetary tipping points, which, if crossed, one is the Greenland ice sheet, another is an ocean current. If those are crossed, it will devastate UK agriculture, very dramatically change temperature. And of course, those will have effects all around the world. So there's also this now, as you were saying in the beginning, this understanding that security, and actually militaries have raised the alarm for many years about the security implications of climate change. So there's, now very clear new thinking around, we have to move, which we discussed in our report in 2023, we have to move to new conceptions of planetary security, Earth system security, which is a holistic understanding of the Earth system science, the risks that we're running, and that we can't, silo these various fields, and also energy security within that. We need an energy transition pathway that provides true energy security given the GHG and other realities we have. And then on the economic front, so this goes to hard numbers again. So we have this really frightening security kind of a picture that we're understanding more. Then on the economic front, there are a few really interesting recent studies of the Potsdam Institute published in Nature. They're predicting about 19% damage to average 19% damage to global GDP by 2050 along current trajectories. The Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, together with Exeter University, another very evidence-based study crunching the numbers, 50% damage to GDP by 2070, 2090. So these are hard economic security issues that I think policymakers will have to get their heads around. So this is also the kind of inflection point that we're at as an international community. Antonio Guterres, our Secretary General, said a few years ago, we're at an inflection point in history. We need breakthroughs if we're not going to have breakdown. And just one more economic voice that I was made aware of recently, one of the board members of Allianz, one of the major global insurers, issued a very dire warning saying, listen, we're headed towards general economic collapse because as things become more and more uninsurable, this will have implications across the economy for assets, for any kind of financial investments, et cetera, et cetera. And again, these are very hard-nosed business people. And I think a lot of the business people we are working with, including at very big companies, understand this. And many of them are, however, looking at more short-term economic risks, supply chain risk, climate, nature risks along their supply chains, and getting very nervous about those risks. but the broader economic picture, but also what a great bargain it is to invest now in the transitions we need, to make those investments now. And this is also what developed nations don't quite realize yet, that them giving actually a very small portion, I mean, to get the required investment would be less than 1% of their GDPs to really invest seriously in the transitions we need. That is saving them so much money, trillions of dollars in damage, and relatively soon. So I think a lot of it is bringing, the latest research and knowledge and getting coalitions, in the business world and in the political realms of rational actors who can really look at the risk landscape and their own economic self-interest to do the policy shifts. And from our perspective, we think that, the policy innovation, you mentioned that companies are often moving faster than governments. And indeed, we did a study of progressive businesses in Scandinavia, but more broadly a few years ago. And I've heard this again and again from many ambitious companies who want to move faster. There isn't this policy innovation mentality. And this is true for, finance and accounting and reporting standards. So we have proposed the Climate Governance Commission, an international policy innovation hub or clearinghouse, which is a really important idea and has gotten a lot of excitement wherever we've discussed it. So this sense of having good data, good science, good economic awareness about the nature of our predicament, and then getting excited about the policy innovation and the governance. And we have some excellent governance models, policy models and insights. And I think the progressive private sector can be very much involved in a very principled way because they know also, you mentioned that they need the stability, they need to do the medium and longer term planning. And one of our partners, Exponential Roadmap Initiative, based in Sweden, they have a $1.2 trillion corporate ecosystem. But before the last Swedish elections, they managed to put together companies, very big companies representing about 20% of Swedish GDP, saying we need stable, clear, bold climate policy and action. So I think we need to actively, support those businesses' voices also who just understand the business case.
Brilliant, thank you. So lots to unpack there, and I think this hub you developed is something everybody's going to want to know about. It's such a good idea, but if I can pick up something Lee said before I circle back to it, I mean, the issue about joining the dots is so important. Right? So it's a great thing to do. But in something else I do, which is actually on climate and security and finance, in Geneva, I see that the dots are very infrequently joined across those two things. And it's not so much that people don't see the logic, it's that there's a sort of chronological, temporal misstep where people always assume it's going to happen to somebody else later as opposed to happening to them now. And the speed at which it's happening is so key. So it's joining the dots in a way that makes sense so the opportunity cost of capital is affected. Because the other bit of this, which is so complicated, is how the issue of going to emerging markets and the amount of money that's required in emerging markets is one thing, but many of those emerging markets are massively burdened by debt servicing requirements, which are really fundamentally destructive at the moment. I mean, we've got 34 countries in Africa paying more for their debt servicing than they are for education and health combined, which is not as useful as it might be. But that then, I just wonder, you said something earlier, and this, ladies and gentlemen, is so unscripted, you couldn't possibly believe it. So all these questions are completely off the cuff and unknown to these poor panelists. But you mentioned cities here, and we have a session later on about arid cities. It strikes me that very frequently it is that local level of governance, that local level of interaction, that local level of knowing which projects, which programs are essential, that can actually be quite helpful. Is that something that you agree
yes. Now to that, and just reflecting on what Maya said, I think what we need to also reflect on, and have a good understanding of taking stock of what is the lowest common denominator, which are the clients, which are the customers, the general public. And in my interactions in various parts of the world, I have come to realize that there is a huge and growing awareness of this transformation. And I also strongly believe that we are living through this change, and it's very difficult for us to grasp the enormity of this change that we are living through, the change to more sustainable, transformative ways of living and existing. So we're living through it, and I think that's where the corporate world is far ahead than the government or governance provided by the governments in many parts of the world. And because they have seen the writing on the wall, and they are working towards it, because they don't want to be the Kodaks and the Nokias of the future. So I think there are many positive aspects to that, but reflecting on your specific question, we need to really, as I said in the first part, that we need to democratize the climate finance and ensuring and empowering the local communities, and through that municipalities and cities and so on. So there is a lot of movement happening there, and it's a question of both the private sector and the governments taking stock of that and then implementing the policies in the boards or in policy making in the governments.
You said this before, in terms of democratizing these funds. And we heard with Professor Yunus and his inspiring and quite remarkable achievements that he has managed to attain over the last 30, 40 years. I mean, the democratization of finance is possible at a microfinance way, but also it's possible in different ways with different types of instruments, with retail finance, with a whole different... Is there a combination that you think of which is particularly useful here?
Yeah, I think it's a complex thing to unpack what I mean by democratization of finances, starting with the multilateral banks, that they need to really, as you also said, de-link growth from sustainable development. I think that is very important, and also providing the possibilities and flexibilities to those 34, 35 countries who are paying more in their servicing the debt than their infrastructure or the development and social aspects of their countries. So that needs to be changed, and there is already a very good initiative there, the Bridgetown initiative by the Prime Minister of Barbados, and that is slow in the implementation, but that needs to be accelerated, and I'm hopeful that that will happen. And another very good instrument that is waiting in the seam, so to speak, is the carbon markets. That was the whole Article 6 of the Paris Agreement was fully approved, finalized at last COP in Baku. And carbon markets will be another very big opportunity to mobilize the funding and the capital that will be needed to flow down to the lowest common actors.
Just in terms of the Bridgetown agenda, it has lots of different aspects, but a couple are, one is on looking at the Bretton Woods institutions, which may be happening faster than we anticipated in a way other than we anticipated. But also a vulnerability index, which actually looked at how countries' vulnerability to climate change, to your point, Maya, was going to have an impact on particularly if they've graduated from the IMF schemes, we're going to have access to concessional finance in order to enable them to cope. If you are a Caribbean island, it's happened to Grenada twice, I think now, they've lost 200% of their GDP overnight, which is not a great place to be, particularly if you've graduated and therefore access to finance is so expensive. But then a sort of a subsequent question to that, and as to the democratization bit, is it's accessible if it's affordable. And do you think there's an area here of concern whereby as the risk profile, both of countries, climate change, as I was saying, how the insurance markets are operating, the capitalization of these processes, is there going to be enough concessional finance to enable that buffering impact to actually take effect quickly enough?
I think that'll happen through the green bonds, and we're already seeing that market developing, and I see more and more of those financial instruments being sort of implemented and issued in various markets. So again, as I said with everything else, I think all of those things are there. It's a question of we need to accelerate it and build upon it and popularize it as best as we can, and these are the forums that can help do that.
Brilliant. So then, Lee, asking a horrible sort of techie finance question in terms of how this might work. If you look at where the money is flowing, a lot of it is into private equity, some of it's into the debt markets, some it's into the venture capital markets. Obviously, it's a variegated market depending on the risk. Do you think there's do you think the venture capital market, which tends to go for low risk and high returns, or high risk and very high returns, is going to be a sufficiently robust instrument to get to the emerging market technological fixes which might emerge? Or do you feel there's going to be a sort of a need of some concessional finance linked to venture capital which can actually provide the accelerated finance that's required? Because the great thing about private sector finance, it does operate quickly, right, as opposed to government public sector finance, which I can tell you from my years in the World Bank, takes millennia to get out.
I think that the venture capital that is the market that is out there, they're very much aware of making sure that their capital is directed to the right initiatives, and that's where I strongly also believe that innovation will be key, and I see there are many fantastic innovations in addressing the various aspects of climate change and reducing the cost of transaction cost, including of financial flows, are there, including from solar, wind, and other forms of storing energies and all of that. So venture capital is already flowing there because they know that is where the maximum returns are, and they also know the risk of that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Lee, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I guess it's just a step back. I think in obviously in the West, it's 20, only in terms of this investment, it's about 20% comes from government, right? It's mostly private capital, and I think it's probably the inverse of that, or at least half of the money, and more than half comes from the public sector when we look at the market you're talking about. So it's a good starting point. So how do we sort of tip it in the other direction? But maybe I would just like to make one observation that's sort of contrary. So we keep talking about corporates, but I think we need to talk about business, because there's a difference between large corporates and, let's say, an entrepreneurial business, right? It's very fundamental in the understanding. A lot of corporates sort of operate, they have predominantly sort of rent-seeking behaviors versus, entrepreneurs create value. That's it's what Peter Drucker said. It's about fulfilling the unmet need, and typically their risk profiles are, different. More importantly, more fundamentally for the developing markets, is all big businesses start as small businesses, and that's sort of the failure of the narrative in the West we talk about. Because at the end of the day, it's not the big corporate that'll get us there. It's the smaller, medium enterprises in the value chain that will deliver the net zero piece, right? So how do we work with them, and how do we invest with them? And when we start there, I do think there's a great opportunity, because you start to look at the value chain and where it's at and the scale it's operating at. And there are certain technologies, a combination of technologies, are quite attractive. And so it might not be a capital issue as well. It might be, I would say, I'd argue, just as strong as a talent issue, right? Just the demographics of the world, we'll be squeezed for talent eventually. Right now, I think the money, part of the public sector money, is just going in the wrong direction of, harmful subsidies, where we could actually create, you're never going to take the money away from the farmer, but we could redirect it towards, right, more sustainable use and not take the candy away, so to speak. But when you get past that, I think there are some interesting combinations. And some of it is technology, so I do see it in the geospatial area, because you said carbon markets. I totally believe that if we can price it right and get the incentives, it's perfect, but you have to be able to trust and verify, right? And how are we going to do that? That's really going to be a combination of technologies. It's going to be on-the-ground sensors connecting the Internet of Things, but with geospatial technologies. But it's all unstructured data, so it'll have to sit with somewhere in the AI. But it will be giving us the sort of the trust that we can, where you can verify and validate and measure and monitor and record what you're paying for here. And I think we're getting there because of these other things coming online. All of that, though, requires us to think about, again, going back to things like data centers and the carbon footprints and such. So we do have to keep connecting those dots. But Steve Jobs said one other thing. He said, you know, creativity is connecting things, and it's really easy to do in hindsight, but it's really hard. It's almost impossible to do when you try to exercise foresight, because you have to trust your instincts on this. And I think we have to, collectively sort of trust our instincts that actually all big things start small, and we need to go where there's a lot of small businesses. We should also recognize that being an entrepreneur means really leaning in or falling in love with the problem and that unmet need and going out there and doing this. And if we can start to sort of rally around those as sort of compass points, because there's no roadmap, right? Yeah, I think the money will follow, because the people who want to have an impact, they understand demographics, they understand where the people are, where the data will need to get to. They understand that still we have 800 million people without electricity in the world, but when they do connect, it's going to quickly be into a digital economy, or they'll be digitizing whatever they're doing, but it has to be in a renewable sense. We have to store that, we have to distribute that. There are a lot of things, and again, it's about connecting these dots, and I do feel that you see it every day, strange headlines, small modular reactors being, 10-year investment horizons to build these things, but for what? To basically clean energy for AI, right? And data storage, right? So, we can redirect that. I do think it's about reminding ourselves that, those closest to the problem are also closest to the solution, and to kind of engage with the entrepreneurial communities there. And the governments will be there, and I think at best they can make a better enabling environment. At worst, obviously, there's not just tariff barriers, there's non-tariff barriers and lots of things that impede development. But I think part of this is the big corporates to work through their value chains and really be supportive even to the small and medium enterprises. I think we'll have those network effects that we're looking for. And that's what, fundamentally, it's about those network effects that will come from working with those small or medium enterprises in these emerging markets and developing economies.
That's really helpful and a great insight. And focusing on the SMEs is always good, but it does require, and something which the Qatar Foundation is doing so effectively, is linking health and education to sustainability. And it's
one other point is the tickets are not as big, right? That's the other. I worked in an aid agency, and obviously the incentives to sort of move money is you don't want to have to do lots of little things with lots of little things to comply with and monitor and measure. You like to do one big thing, and the reality is that's the structural problem to some degree. Many of these people working in these areas, they're not looking to scale. They might look to replicate this, but their capital needs may not be sort of grab the attention of those who actually can supply the capital.
Although providing the clutch mechanism between small and big is not uncomplex. I mean, because it does require a process of aggregation, of standardization, of risk transfer, which is itself quite expensive. So you do need this concessional finance somewhere in the mix to enable that to happen.
That's right. That's the concession. That's exactly. The clutch is a great metaphor, and it is concessional. But do we understand what that means? It's just a little bit below market, a little more time. It's not giving it away. It's just terms that sort of match up better with the project and the needs. Right. It's not we I think in our minds that we're sort of going to just throw money out with a zero return. That's not the case at all. Right. And today's market, as I said, is what's this? Look at the safest assets out there in the long term, and you're going to see now the insurers and others sort of rethink where they're putting their money in certain, sovereign bonds at the moment. I think that there's a recalibration happening.
Yeah, and flight capital does, of course, fly, which is sometimes can be helpful. So, dear colleagues, we have a few minutes left. The traditional last question. You have one thing which you would do. What is it to reimagine climate finance to have the greatest impact? What would it be, Maya?
Yeah, I do again think this is a very exciting field, and the sort of professionalization and the technical knowledge that's been now built up around high quality climate finance, both in the governmental and private sector. So I think a key thing that we need in order to do what we need to do is really vision about the quantum. It must be in the trillions. It has to be across the board, private sector, but the governmental funding is absolutely fundamental. Grants, not only concessional, but also grants. You mentioned the debt crisis. So I think what I would love to see is a comprehensive roadmap for the international community. So this would involve multilateral development banks, but also national development banks are sort of a sleeping giant, I think, in the climate finance field. They're closer to the cities and smaller projects, working in local currencies, have the local knowledge, but they need a lot of capacity building. They also need support and financing. But just to give you a sense of how powerful they could be, it's about 20 trillion in terms of their assets versus multilateral development banks, about 2.2 trillion or so. So it's just about, as we've been talking about, connecting the dots, and I'd love to see a comprehensive, macro roadmap and action plan to use all the resources that we have at our disposal, and to catalyze the awareness of basically, the insurance policy and self-interest it is of developed countries, but the international community at the moment, we have, 100 trillion, over 100 trillion per year global GDP. We have more than enough resources to really capably tackle this problem. So a visionary, bold roadmap mobilizing the various actors, I would love to see that.
With agreement for its implementation.
Fully agree with all, especially the last part here. What I would say is cost of inaction would be enormous. I think we need to get away from that, and even against the headwinds that we are facing in today's world with the geopolitical situation in many parts of the world, I think now is the time to double down and make sure that that North Star of 1.5 degrees is what we focus on, and we do everything we can to mobilize, finance, and stop the sort of duplication and bureaucratization of the existing funds, because I think there is a lot of capital out there. It's a question of releasing it and making it more accessible, democratizing it, and ensuring that this transition that we are living through is accelerated.
Lee, thank you so much, Rohit. Thank you. Lee.
Yeah, I guess I anticipate, it's part of the human condition. I think it's going to be a little bit more pain before we get people to pivot. But sort of understanding the political economy, and also, I guess, in many parts of the world, really the realities of where the carbon emissions come from. I think the food sector, the agri-food sector, is a great place to start because it's 25% of the emissions, but it's the biggest user and polluter of water, and we know it's the biggest employer, and it's one of those things that when we get past, when the mean average temperature gets to 1.6, 1.7, we're going to really feel it and understand the effects there. And it has a lot of small business interests. I think it's where the political economy will work, where that governments will put that money there. It's probably the oldest, farmers are the oldest political lobby I think I know of in any part of the world. And once it starts to hit them, but also we understand it and we need it, I think there was a place there. But it's also a great payoff place because back to Ma's point about planetary boundaries, I think most of the planetary boundaries are sort of anchored around what's happening in the agri-food system. So we have to start somewhere, start locally, then I start to keep my eye on that. And there's some very interesting and innovative entrepreneurs in that space. A lot of local, great young people thinking about the food system and climate and water and connecting the dots. So I'm optimistic if we can kind of get some energy and attention in that space.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, all three of you. I feel enormously privileged to have been allowed to chair a panel of such wisdom and such insight and such experience. And from all of those three things, and this is not necessarily an inevitable outcome, what you have brought us is a message of hope and a message of optimism, as well as great technical, sort of articulate narratives which are full of detail and structure and subtlety. but for your message of hope and optimism, I thank you so much. And ladies and gentlemen, we are now ready to go. Thank you.